We're going to discuss particular aspects of the defenses when they are utilized against aggression. And I want to tell you, as I said in lecture 1, that the defenses, the list of defenses that we're going to deal with today was produced at the Hampshire Clinic in a program called the Index by Dr. Sandler, and in which Anna Freud participated very actively because, as you know, she had an interest and really published a book on defenses. So the list belongs to the Hampshire Clinic. The content of each one of the defenses is something that was produced at the Carter-Jenkins Center in the aggression group. It's a study group that we have on aggression. And so no responsibility goes to Hampshire for it, it's all our work. Responsibility. Now, there are some defenses that are specific for the aggression. And of course, in the work of the Hampshire Clinic, you will see there are one or two such defenses mentioned here. What we have tried to do is to find examples for this enormous list of defenses, not dealing with the libidinal side of the conflicts, but with the aggressive side of the conflict. So here we have repression. And aggression won't be available even when it is necessary to defend oneself or one's right if you repress the aggressive drive. So when you need it, it's simply not there. Now, as typical of repression, it requires an anti-cathexis. That is a force that opposes the drive that has the same, at least the same strength, if not more, to avoid it going into behavior or into consciousness. And that means that it spends a lot of the ego energy. If the conflict is very large, then the ego energy goes in the process of the counter-cathexis and the person is quite restricted. In any case, when you have repressed aggression, it frequently inhibits things like competition for jobs, for girls, and things of that kind. And one knows that it is repressed because it is not present, when it would be pretty normal to show it, to display it. Or there is a lack of participation in anything that is competitive, like sports and things of that kind. Indeed, the person without aggression is in some difficulty. Now remember as well that appropriate forms of aggression are necessary for many reasons, including survival. Now this is interesting in this sense. The human animal, given that it has the brain that it has and the intelligence that it has, seems to have bypassed what in the animal world a ritualistic type of behavior which stop aggression from being too damaging. In other words, they have the dances and things and so on, and usually the problem gets resolved in that particular way. We don't do that. We are quite brutal. We are probably the most aggressive of all animals. And it's interesting, for example, let me give you an example. In a colony of monkeys, yeah, they have a certain territory which is important to them because of their food, for survival. And if some strange monkey tries to come into that territory, or a group of them, then you will have a severe confrontation. But it usually doesn't go to the kill, as does, unfortunately, with human beings. So they do it just because they need the space. It's vital for their survival. Now, there is this other defense called displacement. And in this defense, what happens is that the child discharges his anger away from human objects by instead kicking the dog, the cat, a piece of furniture, or something of that type. Some adolescents and adults may put holes in the drywall of the house where they are, by hitting it, or get the doors out of the hinges by throwing them forcefully rather than closing normally. Let me perhaps mention that when I was director of the patient unit at the University of South Florida, one of the difficulties we had is that we had 80%, 70% of the adolescents there had conduct disorders, and many of them were very aggressive. And of course, before I came to this program, that building was being kind of built, and it should have been built without drywall. Indeed, once the University of New Mexico consulted me about it and said, don't put drywall in the inpatient units. Brick. All right? Covered, obviously, with a coat of cement. Now, in the adolescent unit here at the university that I was director, it was not uncommon for children to put holes in the wall or other aggressive type of behavior. And of course, if you have, as we did, some 15, 20 children and 15, 20 adolescents in this unit, you could have a lot of holes because this behavior is frequently imitated by those that have oppositional defiant disorders and conduct disorders and so on. The aggression is treated relatively easy and is usually a social aggression. Now, they of course have more control over this than they show. And the way we dealt with it is that we figure the cost of repairing the wall and make them work in the unit, cleaning windows and the floor and things of that kind, for the value of the damage that they have done. And I can tell you that that stopped the holes in the wall real quickly. Indeed, it was kind of funny because when new cases came in, they immediately informed them that they would have to work very hard, to repair, to pay for the repair of the wall. So, in these cases that I am describing to you, many of these children and many of these adults that engage in this behavior, they have more control than they show. Now, the next one that we want to deal with is called reaction formation. And a reaction formation is a defense that turns certain negative things like hate, cruelty, and so on into kindness, generosity, love, altruism. That's in terms of the aggressive drive. A certain degree of ego development, of course, is necessary before it can take place. You can expect a one-year-old child to necessarily be able to develop reaction formations directly. It comes a little late, but not much later. Now, it helps to build up a nice empathic personality and character, because the aggressive components in all its manifestations, as I mentioned, some hate, cruelty, and so on, is transformed into kindness, as we say, generosity, love, altruism, and so on. And a person with such characteristics is really a very desirable human being. It's a useful defense, and the thing that is valuable about it, in contrast with what we said about repression, where a lot of ego energy is spent in the content cathexis, in this defense, once the change of hate into kindness or love is achieved, it doesn't require any more expensive of energy, like, as I said, repression does. It's like, I don't know, think of a river, and then you want it to run in another direction. You make a canal, and you open that canal at some point, and the water will start to flow that way, and you don't have to do anything else. It's done once, period. The river will flow in that particular way. Now, I'm kind of remembering, that makes me laugh, that when I visited a town out of here, out of Florida, and I had family there, and we were interested in looking at houses, hopefully to buy one of them. And there was one house that looked very desirable in the advertised. So we went to see it. And I found there what I describe here, a lot of holes in the wall, and a lot of doors out of the hinges, or, you know, somehow contorted and so on. And this family was about to get divorced, and the husband was really very aggressive that way and very out of control. Of course, we did not get the house, we just left the place. Now, let me go to the next defense, which is sublimation. This is probably the best ego defense there is. It's an excellent ego defense that turns, and we're talking now especially the aggressive drive, and not referring as to the libidinal components when this defense is used, dealing with the aggressive drive. And as you see, what we say is that it turns negative aggressive feelings into socially acceptable solutions. There are sometimes very well paid. Think of boxing, professional boxing, and football, for example. So instead of being aggressive to anyone, you engage in these activities where there are rules, they are socially acceptable, and you even are rewarded by them. The next one we want to deal with is called negation. And negation is a defense that we will have to distinguish from something that is called, and we will see a little later, denying words. Here, in negation, the patient is denying something with his words, but he's aware that he's lying. In fact, he's lying, period. Lying, of course, can be used defensively, particularly in certain conflicts with the external world, in children that lie, for example, to parents to avoid being punished when they have done something that they know will anger the parents. But it's not a defense, properly speaking, since true defenses are unconscious ego activities of which the person is not conscious at all. He doesn't produce the defense when he wants. It's an unconscious mechanism. While of course, if you are dealing with negation, they do that quite consciously, and they know exactly why it is that they are doing it. So that's negation, and as I said, we need to distinguish that from the denial in words that is here. Here the patient denies being angry, for example, but the event of which he is talking is one that usually makes him very angry, and you know that for a fact. But his words, he says, no, I wasn't angry, I wasn't angry. But that's in a session. The words, the way he speaks, the tone of voice, the attitude, and the manner that he has shows that in fact he's very angry. Practically, I say here as a joke, smoke seems to be coming out of his ears while he is engaging in this speech, denying in words his aggression. Now, another defense is called denial in action. And here, and we're only talking, as I have repeated several times, we're only dealing with the aggressive drive. There are many other things that you can say in terms of the libidinal function of these defenses. In this case, for example, a person gives a gift or a donation to a person or an institution that he's furious with, instead of feeling his anger. In other words, he does something that denies that he's angry. And he's doing that to himself. He's not trying to fool the other person or the institution, just like the patient that uses denial in words. He's not trying to fool the psychotherapist or the psychoanalyst. He simply, and that's what he believes. Because feeling the aggression or the hate or the fury or whatever the manifestation of the aggressive drive is in that case is highly conflictual and consequently cannot be done. Hence the denial. Now you see there are several forms of denial. We mentioned already denial in words, there is denial in action, which we just are talking about. It is commonly seen in other fears, such as fear of heights, for example, or fear of death, and in such cases, for example, in the fear of heights, the person takes parachuting, this is denial in action. In the fear of death, he may go into car racing or join the army and things of that kind. Now there is too denial in fantasy. Of course, a fantasy will deny the anger or expressive or explosive episode that took place where he went, or the person with the person that he was talking to, or what he did, you know, when he became angry or violent or did something aggressive and inappropriate in whatever circumstances. And the way that the denial in fantasy deals with it is by creating a fantasy that he had not really gone to that place, he went to the movies instead, or whatever he wants to do in the fantasy, or he went to a different meeting, or he didn't go to that place, as I said, or went to see a different particular person and so on. That's the denial in fantasy. Now, the denial in fantasy is very useful because it helps with the guilt, the shame, and the conflict of this type. And the patient, of course, retains reality testing. In other words, he knows that he's denying in fantasy. Yeah. But you see, he does this automatically. He produces a fantasy where he undoes what had happened earlier on. Now the another one is condensation. Condensation is frequently combined with displacement. And here what you can say is that in terms of the aggression, that the anger, the irritability, the fury, the dislike, the hostility, the hate or whatnot may be felt towards the wrong person, all being irrational. In other words, by making a condensation between two people that have some similar traits, for example, blue eyes or the race, whatever, white, Chinese, black, or the nationality or the accent, a variety of possible ways lead to a condensation. In other words, a single trait of that person is then displaced to another person, and there is a condensation. The two persons become one and the same. And so, of course, the feelings that are expressed against the person in which they have been displaced are completely irrational and puzzle that person because they have nothing to do with what led to that situation. There is a question of internalization. Internalization is an interesting defense, common, very common, and implies that one throws out, moves out the conflict in oneself to the outside, to the external world, generally to another person. For example, the person will say, I really don't hate him. He hates me. In other words, he's attributing to that person the feelings that he has and are intolerable to him. Then he moves them outside to somebody out there. Now, externalization may or may not be followed by projection, but frequently it is followed by projection, and which always, as I say, has to be preceded by an externalization. But what happens then is that have been externalized now comes back as a threat to the self. It's like a boomerang. You throw it against a person and it comes back and may hit you. And he hates me. That's the externalization. The boomerang part is and wants to hurt me, kill me, damage me, steal from me, God knows, whatever it may be. As you see, dealing with this type of aggression in this way, it's a very costly and damaging ego defense because it interferes with reality testing. In other words, you don't know the reality. This person doesn't want to kill you or hurt you or anything. So your reality testing is gone. And that's frequently a defense that is seen in very sick people, including, for example, schizophrenics. Paranoid people very commonly have this kind of problem. Then we have introjection or internalization. And here what gets introjected depends in the parent's character, their personality or their attitudes, as well as their culture. As such, it can be a positive ego-building defense, but at times it may have very negative connotations and characteristics depending on the quality of what gets introjected or internalized. Now, identification is a defense where you become like the other person, or only some aspects or characteristics of that person, but sometimes it's the whole person. Generally, it's an ego-building defense. Indeed, personality development and the character that people develop is the result of a large numbers of identification all through life, the life of the child and adolescent. But, as I said earlier, it depends on the nature of the identification, as we said for introjection and internalization. It depends what you identify with, because this defense is such that you change and acquire such characteristics that you are identifying with. You become like that person, or certain aspects of the character of that person and things of that type. So, whether the identification, which is a good defense that develops the personality and the character, is of a positive nature, that be very desirable. But there are some possible negative identification that lead to behaviors that are highly undesirable. There can be, and frequently are, cultural factors, such as, for example, extreme Muslims believing that Christians have to be converted either by the word or by the sword, you know, and that is a significant cultural factor, which of course has a lot to do with the personality. Now there is imitation. Imitation is an interesting defense that let me give you a gross example, which in this case is not necessarily connected with the aggressive drive. But for example, imitation is letting some adolescents did this at the time where the Beatles were popular. They let their hair very long, grow very long like the Beatles, without necessarily knowing consciously the real reason why they were forced to imitate them. They just did it. And it had a meaning, but they didn't know what that meaning was or what that reason was. In the case of aggression, which is really what we're trying to do, what is being imitated is the aggressive behavior of gangsters, gangs, violent people, or some other type of aggressive or delinquent behavior. And of course, in that case, that's a disaster, as you will imagine. It's certainly not a desirable one. Now, identification with the aggressor can have benign and malignant forms to it. For example, doing to the dog what the dentist did to you in the case of children. That's an identification with the aggressor. It's a simple one, you know, children. It appears a lot in children's play, and if you see children, you see a lot of that. Some used in concentration camps identify with the Nazis, and that was rare, but it did happen on occasion, because of the unconscious belief that their life may be spared if they collaborated with the Nazis in the concentration camps and things of that kind. Here you have a defense called regression. And in regression, for example, let me check that I didn't jump something. No? Yeah. In regression, for example, to the anal sadistic stage, which may turn people into sadists, even sadistic murderers, or the like, is due to conflict at a higher level, which then force the regression to earlier previous fixations. Fixation points are required, and when the conflict is too strong at the higher level, the regression, let's say the aggression comes back to the anal sadistic stage, and then you get all of this type of phenomena. This can frequently does contaminate the sexual life of these people, so that they need to inflict pain to their sexual partners or objects in order to get really sexually aroused, otherwise they can function. And that's a extreme case. There are many in-between cases where simply causing some hurt, though it may be mild and so on, is important to these people, otherwise they can't quite function. Some of them may turn into masochists that somehow need to be abused in some form or another, or hurt. And that's not only in the sexual realm of things, but even in the ordinary life, and as I said, on the sexual life as well. Okay, so that's regression. And the important thing about regression is what I told you already. There must be a fixation point, and that's acquired during the process of development into adulthood. And it may be at any of the libidinal levels or the aggressive levels of development, you know. Because there are different types of aggression, oral aggression, anal aggression, phallic oedipal aggression, and things of that kind. So it depends on the level, you know. But if the conflict is, as I said, let's say, very high at the phallic oedipal level, then, and they have a fixation at the anal level, they will go back there. It's not a good defense. Because though it solves the problem at the higher level, it creates new problems at the lower level, which may be worse than the ones that he's running from. Now there is withdrawal into fantasy that is different from the one we discussed. It's a withdrawal into fantasy. Here the ego is in control, but which means can control his aggression. But in his fantasy, in other words, he doesn't act on his hate, or he's furious, he doesn't hit out. But in his fantasy, the person he's angry with gets hurt, destroyed, killed, damaged, and disappears. You see, so in other words, instead of acting out his aggressive thing, this defense takes it into. The aggressive acts don't take place outside, they take place in fantasy. Another example is that you fantasize not having gone there, as we said, earlier, but somewhere else, in which case the discussion, verbal abuse, aggressive act, or violence would not have taken place, and we refer to this as a fantasy. The withdrawal into fantasy is different from just producing fantasies, because it's more generalized. The person doesn't do that occasionally, but he's withdrawn into his fantasy world. And that, of course, is very damaging too, because in contradistinction with the reference that we made to developing fantasy to deal with some of the guilt that is felt because of the aggressive behavior that one has produced. That's occasional, but this is general. This person is withdrawn into his fantasy world, doesn't live in reality for very long, and as such, I say he may alleviate guilt, but it's not effective since it generally happens after the fact. Aggression is still available to the ego, but it's highly conflictual. Hence the withdrawal into fantasy. There is withdrawal into the self, which tends to avoid conflict, that tends to avoid conflicts, arguments, violence, hate towards others. But of course, may lead and does lead to isolation. In other words, you separate from the world to avoid feeling your negative, aggressive, serious or feelings. Cases, I say here, that some cases of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, may have a smart mouth. In other words, they say things that they regret and that are very hurtful sometimes to the other person to whom they are talking to, and of course they wish they hadn't done that. Because of their inability to control their impulsivity in their thinking and their mouth, they may withdraw into the self. In other words, they isolate themselves from other people to avoid the appearance of the conflict, which will happen it's unavoidable. It's a very restrictive defense in ego terms, as you will imagine. Now, there are other forms of withdrawal. This is withdrawal into passivity. And it does the same. Avoids the potential conflict, the competitive situation for jobs, girls, sport, etc. that may arise. Anger, hate, hostility, fights or wars. And you can see any number of such kind of problems in the day-to-day life and in the news of hate and hostility that leads to the killing of the supposed love object or somebody that has in some way mishandled you or you feel that had been the case. As you see, the withdrawal into passivity places enormous restriction of the ego. That's the price you pay. Because every defense that you think of has a price. Sometimes the price is very high, sometimes it's not high. If you think of repression, the price is very high. If you think of this price is very high. There, when we talk about reaction, formation, and sublimation, there is no cost to those. In fact, there are rewards by these defenses. Rewards come to the self. Now, the withdrawal into passivity is different from the one we're going to discuss, which is passivity. The person is passive. Above, the withdrawal into passivity is like the withdrawal into fantasy and the difference with fantasies in itself. In the withdrawal into fantasy, you do that occasionally to deal with a conflict. When you become passive, you defensive passivity, which is different from the above, since it applies generally and at all times, while the above, that is withdrawing into passivity, is only in a specific case. But the same is true, the withdrawing into fantasy and fantasy is the same parallel. The price of being passive is an enormous ego restriction, because you have to deprive yourself of all kinds of things to avoid conflicts. And this, of course, I'm talking specifically of these defenses as they can be used in against the aggressive drive, but this applies the same to all type of libidinal conflicts. Then there is the turning passive into active. And I give you an example. Someone that knows that he's terminal, or is in pain, or is crippled, or anything of that kind, may decide to commit suicide. In other words, instead of waiting for his death and suffering whatever pain he has, he takes the matter into his hand and actively puts an end to it. That's turning passive into active. The other one would be passively suffering all of these things, doing nothing about it. Now, people may ask, and it's a good question, is that a conflict? People can ask that way. And maybe in religious terms, it may be, because many religions forbid suicide, which has many implications, actually. Because as I said on occasion, in the past, some religions had the control of cemeteries. They were sacred grounds. And that's where people got buried. And if you committed suicide, you couldn't be buried there. But of course, they were making an incredible amount of business because everybody dies. And the cemeteries fill very, very quickly. Of course, nowadays that has changed. They have gone out of the hands of religion into the private business world. So, it may be a conflict, it still is a conflict in the religious sense of the problem. But it is at the same time certainly a defense against suffering, pain and death with all its conscious and unconscious meaning. Is this, I will ask, not otherwise a rational, even logical and adaptive normal decision? Let me discuss a little bit about assisted suicide, which is another form of turning passive into active, only that somebody helps you do it. There is a society in Switzerland called Death with Dignities, and in other various countries they are by law assisted suicide, and on occasion even euthanasia is legal and is practiced and has been practiced for donkey's years. Now the question is, those religious people have the right to interfere with this decision of some human beings. And since I mentioned the assisted suicide possibility, let me tell you that, as I mentioned, this society was founded in Switzerland, and a lot of people go to Switzerland from all over the world. If you go to the election on assisted suicide, you will see that there are people that fly from Australia to end their life in Switzerland. And there are several examples there which show actually vignettes of these people traveling, going to the place, and in one case, even the procedure itself until the person dies. And of course, they do this with the utmost of care. In other words, the person has to be competent, the person has to have an incurable disease, the person has to have significant suffering or loss of dignity, and then they give what they call the green light. Interestingly enough, once they give the green light, and once people knows that they have an out to the situation, many of them don't ever approach death with dignity society again. They wait for the natural death. Now, you should know that beyond Switzerland, Holland and Belgium have practiced this for many, many, many years. And on this side of the Atlantic, Colombia, the Supreme Court in Colombia has accepted the assisted suicide situation. And in this country, there are 3 states. One is Oregon, is the one that has been doing this for longer. It was followed by Washington a little bit, not too long ago, and about a week or 10 days ago, the state of New York has, developed laws for the assisted suicide situation. Now in England, for example, this is by law unacceptable. If you help anyone to commit suicide, you'll be in big trouble with the law and in jail and all of that. Yet, 87% of the population agrees with the assisted suicide situation. And the same is true in many, many countries, including the United States of America, where the large majority, it's a significant majority, approve, wants this to be lawful, and the same is true in Canada. So as you see, this form turning passive into active is extraordinarily interesting in the situation in which that happens. And there is a lot of discussion about it. Now we have now rationalization. This is a very common defense that tries different explanations to justify the aggressive acts of behavior. In other words, you try to make it rational, You had good causes to behave the way that you did. It can and is used by individuals, by groups, and even by nations. A very costly defense, since it blurs people's ability to reason. And now rationalization is not doesn't happen very early on in life, a small child obviously doesn't have enough knowledge to rationalize things, but it's very common in adolescence in the adult world as well. Intellectualization, that's a very common defense. And what it means is given that our knowledge, our intellectual capacities and abilities, we can use all of the above to justify our aggressive behavior or acts. It's in some form similar to rationalization, but it's not the same thing. The first one, you try to make yourself, and maybe those around you, believe that you were behaving in a rational manner. In the intellectualization, is usually we use our knowledge as well as our socio-cultural and religious element, thus showing the role that they have in the forming of our character, which once again shows the influence of the culture in us. And it really requires knowledge, intellectual capacity, and intellectual abilities, or knowledge of history or something, so that you can rationalize that behavior on that basis, which is not necessarily the rationalization. The explanation may be quite silly. In intellectualization, there is more meat to it. The next one is isolation of content. And this is a very interesting defense. It's used in all kinds of situations against libidinal conflict. But here we're talking about the way it is used in the aggressive context. And what happens with this defense is that the feeling, the affect, is present. In other words, the person is angry, is hateful, is, somewhat furious or whatnot. So the affect is present, but the event, that situation, that triggered these feelings of in this particular person are not connected to that situation. And that's why it's called isolation of content. In other words, what happened is isolated from the affect. So something, as we said here, triggers the anger, for example, but the event that did it is not associated with it by any means. Let me tell you a little bit more about it. Just to give you an example and make it clear. Let's say that a married couple that is having some economic difficulties, the wife went out and spent more money than she ought to. And when the husband finds this out, he becomes very, very angry with her the whole day. But he doesn't know why he's angry with her. In other words, he's not associating with the fact that his anger was triggered off by her spending more money than he should. Now, in the isolation of affect, what is isolated is the affect. Whatever the affect in the large series of affect that aggression can induce is not present, it's not acceptable, it's not felt, when it would be logical and expectable for it to be manifested openly. On occasion, it may lead to a displacement. For example, it's expressed in relation to an event where it doesn't really belong. In other words, the affect tries and look for an explanation in a given situation which is not the real situation. That's why it's displaced somewhere else. In some cases, in many cases, there is no displacement at all. It's just a person doesn't know what triggered this off. Though it's pretty obvious for anybody else that knows the situation or hears the story or whatever. Now, that's the isolation of affect. There is this defense, doing and undoing. Doing and undoing is an interesting defense. Some of these defenses, I should tell you, are more typical of certain phases of development than others. And this is a prototype of one such defense. Doing and undoing is very typical of the obsessional neurosis. For example, the person explodes aggressively or is abusive to the spouse during breakfast for whatever reason. He didn't like the breakfast, he was burned or whatever. But that evening, he will come home with flowers to give to his wife without in any way relating it to the incident in the morning. And the wife may tell him, well, you know where to put your flowers. But he doesn't. He's puzzled because he had not related. He's bringing flowers to his wife, who he had abused in the morning, and is very angry and is not willing to accept the flowers just that easily. Now, splitting is a very malignant defense. It separates the aggressive drive to a part of the ego. It then appears only on occasion, but is hidden at other times, sort of like a split personality. Damaging to the ego that loses control of that affect, and it only appears now in conflict situations that trigger it off. It's not a good defense, it's a very malignant defense. There is now the reversal of roles. And the reversal of roles has something to do with people that were abused as children, for example. This is an example. There are many ways of reversing roles. This is an example. They were abused as children. They made an identification with these people, the abuser, and now that they are older or adults, they have become abusers. Or sometimes the abuse is the result of, as I mentioned, the identification with the aggressor. But the reversal of roles is you become the abuser instead of the abuser. Abuser instead of abused. The reversal of affects. This is a very interesting defense. And for example, talking about aggression, let's talk about war situations where people may feel quite contented and happy when an enormous amount of death or damage to the enemy in inverted commas, has been inflicted through bombing cities, in battles, and so on. And compare that with the sadness and empathy of the reaction to a natural disaster that we generally feel. Like, let's say, the earthquake in Haiti. It's interesting because as you see, you change the quality of empathy, and putting yourself in the place of the other person seems to disappear. What should and normally will give you much pain becomes something that is pleasurable. Now, obviously, to understand this situation, the reversal of affects, we will need to understand the process of turning people, sometimes even friends, into enemies. Because then, that's what happened. They deserve it. So that only hate comes through, and empathy and humanism are obliterated, and your positive feeling for that person have disappeared. The same is true of groups. Groups can reverse affects, and nations can do the same, which is a very, very dangerous kind of situation. Now, there is anticipation by provocation. The child may have destroyed something in his or her home, or may have hurt an animal, or hit a sibling, or somehow hurt the sibling. And then will do something else when the parents are at home to provoke punishment from his parents. And this offense obviously alleviates his guilt. In other words, the parents don't know that he destroyed something, or that he hit or hurt the cat or the dog, or that he hurt the brother or the sister, and so on. So they're not going to do anything about it, because they don't know anything about the event. But then the child's guilt is such that he engages in a behavior that will provoke the parent's punishment. In that way, he alleviates his guilt. Now there is one called somatization. And here, what happens is that your fury, your anger, your hate, your aggression in general, wish to be violent and hurt somebody, is substituted by some kind of symptom of malady instead. In other words, you may develop headaches or whatever, migraines, or any type of somatic disorder. There is this one called overcompensation of feelings of inferiority. And that is by becoming, an example is becoming a bully at school, for example, of a child that really is Mickey or was Mickey and weak and frightened. And so he now compensates by being the school bully and being, quite tough. There is one called making reparation. And this too is an interesting defense, and it's somewhat similar, though different, from doing and undoing. For example, making, it says here that it's somewhat similar to doing and undoing, and it is. I gave you the example of somebody that will donate money to a charity after an aggressive piece of behavior, or after having felt very angry, or having hateful feelings towards somebody. And so what he does is he tries to repair that by being generous and giving money to this, that, or the other, or helping somebody and things of that kind. Now the next one is, and we're getting to the end, is turning aggression against the self. And this is seen very common in children, for example, that are in psychotherapy or analysis, where they tend to engage in very dangerous activities, bound to hurt them, after they have been abusive, aggressive, or whatnot to the therapist. They will jump on top of the cupboard and of course jump in a way that may hurt them. And I remember that when I was in London, we had to be extraordinarily careful with the windows because once one of these things had happened, they have been abusive to you, and they may go to a window in a way that they could fall. So obviously they were always kept closed and difficult to open and all of that. Now, sometimes adults, the next one, let me go to the next one, which is turning aggression against the self. And this is one of these defenses, as I told you earlier, that was already specifically described as a defense against the aggressive drive, because it turns your aggression that was to be directed to the outside world against the self. This defense is seen very commonly, as I said, in children. And it's what I'm repeating myself, but I'm doing this for a reason. I want to tell you that it happens as well in adults. I gave you that example, which is good, but let me give you some example of how adults do this. A famous painter, Vincent van Gogh, used a belt was a belt, like the one used by the police in his country, which was, quite an awesome belt. And he used that to hit himself in the back whenever he felt aggressive against other people. The typical situation for him, for example, was he wanted to become a pastor, and he went to Amsterdam and tried to join, in the place where you have to study to become formally a pastor. Unfortunately for him, his father, as you know, was a pastor. Unfortunately for him, part of the training required learning some Greek words and some Greek verbs. And of course, he wasn't able to do that. That defeated him completely. And he used to tell his teacher, but why don't you think this is nonsense? All I want to do is have people that are sick and make them at peace with the world and the problem. What do I need this for? In any case, he failed, because he thought that these people were doing something that was stupid, make him aggressive, that he couldn't become a pastor because of the difficulty that they have created. And in such a situation, he will go and hit himself. Or other things that he did is will walk in winter without a coat, in a severe winter. He had coats, but he wouldn't wear them as a form of punishment for the same reason. And of course he had no awareness of why he was doing this or anything of the sort. In some forms of suicide, or even in death with dignity cases, there might be, as I said, an unconscious element of turning aggression against the self that is hurting or killing you. So you want to kill it. It's different from turning passive into active. You do it the same thing, and probably it's the same, but you do it for a different reason. Now this is the last one. It's called delegation. And this was a defense that was not produced at the Hampshire Clinic, but it was a defense that was suggested by an analyst by the name of Stone, a very distinguished person, in 1971. What happens here is, and this is a quote, that the individual denies himself the fulfillment of aggressive wishes, but concedes permission for it to higher authorities, such as the state, the police, the military, the army, or other legal authorities. And this was quoted, that's the end of the quote, it was quoted by Anna Freud in the Symposium of 1972 on aggression. So this person that does this, that concedes permission to be aggressive to higher authorities, like the state and the police and so on, can enjoy the fulfillment of its aggression, but only in a vicarious form. And that really ends the program. Here in this slide you can see what the web page of the center is, and if you click in there it will take you to these different places where you can see all kinds of programs. And explain what the function of the center is, and hopes that you will send some donations so that we can continue to do this work. And this is the end of the lecture for aggression and defenses. You may have some questions. I can try to answer them.